السلام عليكم. Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. Thank you, Dr. Amin, for a very kind introduction. And I'm honored to be here. I'm grateful to Dr. Amin and his team, Dr. Abu Bakr, Sister Solet, who worked on the planning of this event, and everyone else for your hard work, your support. So, as Dr. Amin mentioned to you, what I am presenting to you is basically an overview of my dissertation, which was, let's see, about 300 pages or so. And so I'm picking out, of course, the most important points. Also, before I go on, how many people here have an actual background in Islamic studies? Just so I know the level at which to speak. All right, so maybe about half, if we include the
There's some
two
people
here.
do and are not raising their hands.
Oh, okay. So I think at least half of the people have a background in Islamic studies. So I will have to try to balance between some more technical aspects and some kind of simpler aspects. All right, who has heard the word Tawatur before? Who has not heard the word Tawatur before? Not heard. Does not know. All right, so a few people don't. That's fine. Yeah, I might be interactive at some points. I generally prefer that rather than just giving a straight-out lecture. I hope that is okay. So, those who do know the word Tawatur, if you don't worry, I'll come back and explain it. Those who do know it, what is your first thought in terms of which of the Islamic disciplines the word Tawatur relates to? Hadith. Hadith, right? This is the first thing that comes to mind. And I think about 10 years ago I would probably have given the same answer. But we will see that actually Tawatur in Hadith is almost a kind of afterthought. The origin of this concept and this term is somewhere else. So what is Tawatur? Let's take a kind of coffee shop definition of it. How many people use Facebook here? Or know about how Facebook works? All right. So let's say you log into Facebook, you see someone has posted a news flash. Maybe just the headline, not the entire article. Some major event, let us say earthquake in Pakistan. This is the first time you are seeing this news. Will you believe it right away from hearing it from one source? You might not, depending who that source is. Right? But if it is not a very credible source, you might be doubtful. Maybe this guy is a practical joker. Right? Maybe it did not really happen. Maybe he's confused. There was an earthquake there 5 years ago and he just heard about it now. So he's posting it. But now as you scroll down, you see someone else has posted the same thing. And the third, and the fourth, and the fifth. As you keep seeing all of these people, who many of them are not related to each other, they've never met each other, there is no way they could have gotten together to discuss and to agree that we will all tell this lie. Once you reach a sufficient number of people, a sufficient number of independent sources, then you acquire certainty. You become sure, all right, this is true, even if I have not seen it. With my own eyes, I have not experienced it myself, but I am certain it is true, just as certain as the fact that I believe that I exist, that I know who my parents are, that I know that China exists. Anyone been to China here? No. All right. So for the rest of you, besides the sister here, for the rest of us, we know China exists, even though we have never been there. What is going on here? It is basically an intuitive, natural process or concept. And it is corroboration that leads to certainty. Corroboration that comes from multiple sources confirming the same information. That is essentially what Tawatur is about. Originally, lexically, Tawatur means to follow one after the other. So if you have information, the same information, coming to you repeatedly from different sources. At some point, you become certain. you reach certainty. Where is that point? This was one of the debates among the scholars. Can we put a number to this or not? How many think we can put a number? All right, good. How many think we cannot put a number? Just to make sure people are awake.
What do you mean was that?
Can we put a number? All right. After I hear it from 2 people, I will be certain. After I hear it from 10 people, I will be certain. 20 people, 100 people. Yeah. Basically, it is difficult to put a number on it because there are many factors involved. Not sure what happened.
Has this been plugged in use of the charger? Can you just double check the...
We'll keep going.
It's plugged in, yeah.
The light?
The light is on?
The light.
The light is on here. Inshallah, it'll come back. It might just be this.
Perhaps the camera is
Probably
going to
the
the projector,
screensaver.
and if it's properly with all the...
Okay, so it's difficult to put a number. As we were saying, if you see just a single report, the first time you see it, if it is from BBC News, for example, you will not look for corroboration. You will believe it right away. You will start to think, what can I do? If you have relatives there, you will start worrying about them. So one source might be enough to give certainty, depending on the circumstances, what the scholars call the qara'in. On the other hand, you might hear the same information from 10 independent sources in another situation, and that might not be enough to give you certainty. So it depends partially on the type of information which is being conveyed also. If 10 different people come in and say there's a Martian outside with his spaceship, chances are we are still not going to believe him. Believe all of these 10 combined. All right. So, getting back to the scope of this term, again, the first thought of most people who know about the term, if you ask them where does this term fit in the Islamic disciplines, they will say it relates to the study of hadith, ulum al-hadith. And this is true, but again, this is not where it started from, and this was not the primary application of the term. Where did the concept come from? Where did the term come from? This is what we need to look at. The concept, of course, is as old as a human being. It is an intuitive human concept. It is not specifically Islamic in that sense. The Greek empiricists, they talked about it in a specific context. They said this is how we know about distant lands we have never been to. This is how we know about historical events. Because we have gotten multiple, we have been informed about this from multiple independent sources. So this is why we believe that China exists, that Australia exists, that the Boston Tea Party took place in Boston, that Thomas Jefferson was in Virginia, and so on, even though we didn't see or hear this and didn't experience it firsthand. So it started with the Greek empiricists, and as far as Muslims went, it actually was initially discussed and elaborated by a specific group of Muslim scholars. In the 2nd century, the Muslim rationalists, or the Mu'tazila. Mu'tazila was a school of theology, a school of aqidah, that put a lot of emphasis on human reason as a means to understand revelation and to make sense of religion and to prove also the validity of religion. So initially it was the Mu'tazila, and perhaps they had already encountered this concept because they were familiar with Greek thought. Maybe this is where they got the idea from, or maybe it was independently. But the Mu'tazila were the ones in Islam, the group of scholars who first discussed and elaborated this term.
Or is it the display? It's your computer, right?
It's a computer, so I'm not seeing anything here. I'll turn it off and turn it on again.
Okay.
However, in time, even though it started with a small group of scholars who, over time, they became marginalized, right? They became marginalized in Muslim discourse, in Muslim society. the Mu'tazila, for the most part, came to be considered as deviant people, people of Ahlul Bid'ah, outside of the kind of mainstream of Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah. And in the Shi'i side of Islam, it is slightly different, of course, because they have a different relationship with the Mu'tazila. But still, they did not see completely eye to eye with the mainstream Shia either. So how did it happen that this concept, which initially was discussed by the small group of scholars who then became sidelined, in time permeated throughout the Islamic intellectual discourse? Everyone now started to use it. Not just Mu'tazila, but Sunnis, Shi'is. By the 5th century, we see this very clearly. Sunnis of all the different schools and persuasions. The Ahlul Hadith, the Hanbalis, the Ashabul Ra'i, the Hanafis, the other schools, the Malikis, the Shafi'is. Among the Shia, we find it among the Zaydis, among the Ithna Asharis, the Imamis. If we look at the schools which are neither Sunni nor Shi'i, they are also talking about this. It has become a major point. It has become common ground. The Ibadis are also talking about it. Actually, we find even Jews and Christians were talking about it. So how did this happen? What is at stake here? Why did it become so important? And how did these different groups understand it and apply it? And were they all talking about the same thing? The people across these different schools, across these different time periods, because we are now talking about 12 to 13 centuries where this term is used, and the different disciplines. The Mu'tazila who started out talking about Tawatur were not scholars of hadith. They were scholars of theology. So when the scholars of theology talk about Tawatur and the scholars of hadith talk about it, are they talking about the same thing, or are they talking about different things? So there are all of these threads we have to unravel and to explore. And that is essentially where the title of my dissertation comes from, Twisted Threads. Sometimes these threads become twisted together, just like these cords sometimes become twisted. You cannot tell. All right, in this case it is easy, but sometimes you cannot tell. All right, this is the beginning of the thread, and there is the end, but what happens to it in the middle? It seems to be confused with many other threads. So I need to unravel them and see exactly what is happening with each one. So this is what I tried to do, to trace how Tawatur spread from its roots with the Mu'tazila in Ilm al-Kalam, didactic theology, and from there to Usul al-Fiqh, where it was further developed, and then to Ulum al-Hadith and to Ulum al-Quran, where it was applied. And more specifically, what I was interested in is to explore how Tawatur was used and to what extent it was influential and important to the Muslim scholars when they wanted to define the boundaries of Islam or boundaries within Islam. Right? Yes. So all these groups usually considered each other as Muslims, Sunni, Shia, Ibadi, Khariji, and so on. But within the boundaries of Islam, there was generally also this conception that, all right, everyone is Muslim, but not all are equally good Muslims, or equally correct Muslims. So there is a concept of rightly guided Muslims and heretical Muslims, people of Bid'ah. So how was Tawatur used in defining the boundary around all of the Muslims and the boundaries within Muslims? That all right? How do we determine who is the most correct Muslim, the most correct type of Muslim, the most correct school of thought or sect? All right. So my dissertation was basically divided into 5 chapters. The first chapter, I look at the roots of this concept in Ilm al-Kalam, in theology. The second chapter, I look at Usul al-Fiqh and the concept of Tawatur in Usul al-Fiqh, and also in Ulum al-Hadith. The third chapter, I look at the issue of Tawatur and how it relates to the Quran. The fourth chapter, Tawatur in Hadith, the actual application of Tawatur to Hadith. And the fifth chapter was my conclusion, where I now come back to look at the bigger picture and to see what role does Tawatur have in drawing these boundaries. outside the external boundary of Islam and the internal boundaries within Islam. All right, so chapter 1, inshallah, the slides will be back soon. But as far as the theological roots of Tawatur, as we said, it started with who? Mu'tazila. In the 2nd century, which is when the Mu'tazili movement or sect is usually considered to have started, with people like Wasil ibn Ata and Amr ibn Ubaid. It was actually Wasil ibn Ata who was one of the first people to comment, to make comments in this direction. What was he concerned about? The Mu'tazila were concerned about truth. All right, of course, many other Muslims were concerned about truth, but the Mu'tazila were especially concerned about the truth of religion and how to defend it and prove it. And so they became concerned about how to deal with the various types of religious texts. We have Quran and we have Hadith. Right? Quran, there was never any question about it, as to what is part of the Quran, what is not part of the Quran. But for the Hadith, especially around this time, 2nd century, the number of Hadith in circulation was starting to increase. And one of the reasons for that increase was not just that people were narrating more Hadith, but also some people were fabricating Hadiths. There was a lot of Hadith fabrication going on, and also, of course, there were people who were making mistakes in transmitting the correct Hadiths. So the Mu'tazila were concerned with this issue that, all right, how can we tell which Hadiths are reliable? Of course, other groups of Muslims were also concerned with this question. The Ashabul Hadith, the Hadith scholars, were concerned about it, and their answer to this question was that we have to look at the isnad, the chain of transmission. Right? We look at the chain of transmission. If someone tells you the Prophet ﷺ said this, and this person himself never met the Prophet ﷺ, you have to ask him, how do you know this? Who told you? He names the person he heard it from. All right, where did this person hear it from? We trace the chain of transmission all the way back until it gets to the Prophet ﷺ, and then we investigate. Who are all of these transmitters? Did they meet each other? Were they trustworthy, ethical, moral people whom we can trust that they would not tell a lie? Did they have a good memory? And other conditions also. Did they narrate something here which is contradicting the Quran? In that case, we cannot accept the Hadith. They must have made a mistake. But primarily it was the isnad that the Hadith scholars were focusing on, at least in the early period. And this was their answer. The Mu'tazila were not satisfied that the isnad is enough. And so they said, we need some other means to vet these hadiths. And one of these means is, they said, we can divide the hadiths into different categories. Basically, the sunnah, or the sunnahs which are transmitted from the Prophet ﷺ, some of them are very widely transmitted. So we have no doubt whatsoever about them, like the number of rak'ah in each prayer. Right? There is no question that dhuhr is 4 rak'ah. If someone claims that dhuhr is 2 rak'ah or that dhuhr is 5 rak'ah, all the Muslims will agree that this person has committed kufr. On the other hand, there are other hadiths that are other sunnahs which are not so widely narrated, which are not so clearly established. So, as you can probably guess, something like the number of rak'ah in each salah would be considered mutawatir. And something else like, let's see, someone give me a hadith.
I don't know if this is a hadith, but we grew up hearing this, that if you have to learn for knowledge, you can go to even China, right? Is that a hadith? Because
it is a hadith. Most of the scholars consider it a weak hadith.
Okay.
But yeah, this will suffice. Because among the hadith, of course, which are not at that highest level, there are hadiths at different levels, and some of them are reliable, some are not reliable. So yes, if we take this hadith, seek knowledge even if it is in China, this hadith is nowhere near as well established as the number of rak'ah for each prayer. So this is what the Mu'tazila were interested in. They thought in terms of the truth value of things. the truth value. What is the level of truth value that we can put on this particular hadith? Is it 100%, like the text of the Quran, or the number of rak'ah in each salah, or is it 90, or is it 50, and so on? All right, so this is why they first started using the term, and then they continued to elaborate the theory. So remember, the Greek empiricists had talked about this concept, but they talked about it in a limited context. They were interested only in knowledge of history and knowledge of distant lands. So the Mu'tazila were actually the first to apply this concept now to the transmission of religious texts. And then they continued to elaborate the theory now. Right? People like Khayyat, Jahid Khayyat, 3rd century, 4th century. And eventually, the concept found its way into interreligious debates. Right? Because the Mu'tazila were at the forefront of, I guess, the interfaith dialogue of those days, which was usually in the form of debates with Jews and Christians and others. And this concept became important because this is, alhamdulillah, one thing Muslims have, which the other nations do not have, at least to the same extent that the Muslims have. The reliable transmission of the Quran especially. And this was often brought up in the religious debates that, all right, the Quran is much more reliable in its text than the Bible, for example. All right, eventually by the 4th century, other people became attracted to Kalam. Initially, among many of the Sunnis, the reaction was negative. They thought, some even went to the extent of saying Kalam is bid'ah, and we don't need it, the Quran is enough for us. If someone is not convinced with the Quran, that's between him and Allah. We shouldn't try to debate with him. But eventually, many of the Sunnis saw the value of ilm al-kalam, and people like Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari and others were key in this, in kind of introducing kalam into the Sunni camp. And by the 4th century, other, whom we would now call Sunni kalam scholars, Ash'aris, Maturidis, and others, they started to join in and also to make use of and to discuss this concept of tawatur. So it was during this time, 4th century, early 5th century, that the concept of tawatur now became consolidated. People like Qadi Abdul Jabbar, the famous Mu'tazili scholar and judge, and Qadi Abu Bakr al-Baqillani, famous Maliki Ash'ari, also judge and scholar of Kalam. It came to be applied, we'll come back to this in just a bit, to debates which now started to happen at that time about the integrity of the text of the Quran, Tahrif al-Quran. Let's shelve that for now, I'll come back to it, inshallah. And then, in early modernity, the concept of tawatur came to the forefront again with some of the Muslim reformers like Sayyid Ahmad Khan, Sheikh Muhammad Abdu, and others. And again, their concerns, if we think about it, were very similar to the concerns of the Mu'tazila. The concern of many of these reformers was that, all right, Islam has become weak, Muslims have lost the position they once held in the world, and it seems a major reason for this is that the religious teachings of Islam have become corrupted with culture, mixed with culture and other superstitions and so on. And so we need to get back to the core of Islam. And one of the key concepts for identifying that core is tawatur. Because yes, if there is a hadith that seems very unbelievable, very unlikely that the Prophet ﷺ said it, but maybe sometimes this happens, people have, it is very widespread and people think it is actually an authentic hadith, then if it is not a hadith mutawatir, then we should re-examine it, right? Maybe people have kind of just become used to it, but if it is not that strongly established, and especially this was a concern, sometimes it seems to contradict with modern knowledge of science and so on, we need to really look at these hadith and see if they were reliable in the first place. So tawatur became a major concept, a major criterion in that regard. All right. So, as we said, this was the Mu'tazila, and then the other Kalam folk took it up from them. But remember, this was only one of the groups, one of the intellectual groups in the early history of Islam. We mentioned something already about the Hadith folk, the Ashabul Hadith. Their concern was very different. Their concern was, all right, we have to remain faithful to what has been transmitted. The Quran and the Hadith and the sayings and the example of the early community. Right? The Sahaba and the Tabi'een and those who followed them. And they said, all right, this is usually what they stress in their books from this period, that salvation lies in following what has been transmitted. And beware of deviating from this even the slightest. So they did not think that much in terms of truth value. They were more concerned with tradition and with precedent and with following what is transmitted. Of course, this does not mean that they did not realize these differences. This is actually a misconception, but some people sometimes have, and I have discussed this in detail in my dissertation, that actually, if we look closely at their writings, we find they were aware that things are at different levels of establishment in terms of their truth value. Right? Some things are more solid in their transmission, some things are more reliable. They were aware of this, but their sensitivity to it was much less than the Mu'tazila. Maybe because they were not involved in interfaith discussions and so on. Thank you. All right. So usually the hadith folk would have less reservations about accepting a hadith which was not mutawatir, even if some Muslims might kind of be a little bit uncomfortable with that hadith. So for example, hadiths describing Allah in a way which seems to be problematic. Right? For example, let's think of one which is not in the Quran. Hadith that mentions something which could be translated as the face of Allah, although that is in the Quran also. There is a hadith in Bukhari which, if you read it literally, it might seem to be saying that Allah has a foot, and He will put this foot in Jahannam.
And also, I think there's one which says that we were created in the image of God.
In the image of God, also that, something like
One
this.
is not in Quran.
So the Mu'tazila, right away, red flag is raised. Right? How can this be? Allah does not resemble His creation. This hadith is suspect. For the hadith folk, usually they would say, all right, if this hadith is authentic, and sometimes some of them who were ignorant and maybe not very intelligent, sometimes they would not even bother to investigate the authenticity. If they found it in a book, they would accept it. They would say, all right, we have no choice but to follow it. The interpretation we leave to Allah. Yes, Allah is not like a human being, but if the Prophet ﷺ said this, we believe it, and leave the rest to Allah. All right, so this was the kind of difference in approach among the early hadith folk compared to the early kalam folk. But eventually, with the persistence from the kalam folk, and kalam eventually came to dominate, the hadith folk eventually adopted the term into their discourse. And in terms of the concept, of course the concept, I think, was implicitly there already in their thought. So it was not that they kind of made a compromise. I think it is more that as they came more in contact with this concept of Tawatur, they found that actually it is a kind of convenient peg for some of the conceptual understandings we already have. Later on then, a few centuries later, Ibn Taymiyyah, famous Hanbali scholar, who was very well read across the Islamic disciplines. He was very well versed in not only in hadith but also in kalam and philosophy and logic and so on. He realized the power of this term, and he adopted it without any reservations. And not only that, but he deployed it back against the kalam folk, who were the people who had first come up with this concept. So he used Tawatur basically as an argument against the kalam folk, the scholars of kalam, for some of their positions. All right. What sort of positions? It was basically some of these hadiths, not the one about the foot, but there are some hadiths describing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this sort of way, which might at first glance seem problematic, that are actually fairly widely transmitted. Our Lord descends to the lowest heavens, Bukhari and other books, in the last part of the night. So Ibn Taymiyyah's argument was that, all right, you, the people of Kalam, you should accept these hadith, and not just accept them, but you shouldn't try to interpret them figuratively, because they are at such a high level of authenticity that they could be considered as mutawatir according to the criterion of the scholars of usul. Okay, we'll go on. From Kalam, then, the concept went into usul al-fiqh. Again, the people who were instrumental in this were people who were involved in both disciplines, people like Qadi Abdul Jabbar and Qadi Abu Bakr al-Baqillani. I think I'll skip over some of these details of usul al-fiqh. Some of it might be a bit boring. But yeah, the theory continued to be developed by the scholars of usul. And by about the 5th century, the kind of theoretical elaboration of Tawatur has reached steady state across these schools. If you read a discussion of Tawatur in a book of usul al-fiqh, it will not make much difference whether you are reading a book of Hanbali usul, or Zaydi usul, or Hanafi usul, or Shafi usul, or any of the others. The way they discuss the concept is pretty much the same. From usul al-fiqh, it then moved into ulum al-hadith. And as early as the 5th century, we have scholars like Qadi Iyad and others already labeling some hadiths as mutawatir. And even though the term tawatur started with the scholars of Kalam, and even up to this point, a significant number of scholars, were still opposed to ilm al-kalam, yet we find the term being used by scholars from both groups, the pro-kalam and the anti-kalam hadith scholars. The term was used, but the debate continued, whether any hadiths are actually mutawatir. Are there any hadiths which give you the same level of certainty that you have for the existence of China, for the fact that the Declaration of Independence of the United States was in which year?
1789.
I don't think so. All right, that
1776.
1776, right. So are there any hadiths which give you the same level of certainty as these facts, or as the fact that dhuhr is 4 rakah? All right, this was the issue basically at stake. And so there was a big debate over whether any hadiths actually meet this criterion. Yes, there are facts like dhuhr being 4 rakah, but this is not coming from the hadith. It is coming from the transmission of the Muslim community from generation to generation. Ibn Salah had a role in kind of bringing this controversy to the forefront, and the debate then continued at a higher level, or kind of with more intensity for the next 2 centuries. Eventually, As-Suyuti, right, died 1505, Common Era 911 Hijri. He was the first to produce a collection of hadith which he said are all mutawatir hadiths. All right, and he had about 100 hadiths in there.
Quick question here.
Yes, after this there were many others. Suyuti's was called الأزهار المتناثرة في الأحاديث المتواترة. بارك الله فيك. Right, basically the flowers which have been kind of threaded together to form a necklace. And that is what al-Azhar al-Mutanathira means. And it is a compilation of hadiths which he felt are authentic. And the criterion he used was that if the hadith is narrated from 10 Sahaba, then this is enough. Then there were many other compilations after this. But all of this is still leaving one issue unaddressed, which I've kind of touched on already, that there is a category of tawatur which is outside of this entire discussion about hadith and isnad. Right? Like the number of rak'ah in each salah. Okay. Tawatur of the Quran, Is the Quran mutawatir, and if so, in what sense? Right? We have isnads for the Quran, which are transmitted to this day. And if you look at these isnads, yes, there are many isnads and many people in these isnads in each generation, at least in recent history. But once we get to the Imams of Qira'ah, right, the 10 Imams, Asim and Nafi' and Kisa'i and Abu Amr and all of these, then the isnad from them back to the Prophet ﷺ is not mutawatir. Right? There's only a couple of links for each of the qira'at. So what does this mean? Does it mean that the Quran is not mutawatir? This is one issue that I was exploring, and actually a lot of Orientalist scholars have made this claim, and some Muslims also have kind of not realized what is going on here, and they have kind of conceded here and said that, all right, we cannot claim that all of the qira'at are mutawatir. So what I have argued here is that, yes, if you look at the isnads, the earliest part of the isnad is difficult to say that the isnad is mutawatir, but if you look at the bigger picture, the Quran is still mutawatir. Right? If you think about the fact that the Quran originally was an oral document, not a written document, how the Quran was so central to Islam and to Islamic devotion and religious life, how every year in Taraweeh, the Quran would be finished, read out loud in public from beginning to end, at least once, probably more than once. And many other factors which I have discussed, you come up with a very compelling case for saying that actually the Quran is mutawatir in the sense of being a widespread and public phenomenon, which is transmitted from generation to generation. Yes, if we come down to the tiny details of differences between the qira'at, for these it might be difficult to substantiate, to prove. It now becomes a matter of faith.
Are you talking about the text or the qira'ah?
Both, actually. For the text, yes. For the text, you can make a much stronger case that the text is mutawatir. Because the text has been accepted across,
right?
At least since the time of Uthman, and actually even most of the Orientalist Western scholars nowadays, most of them are of the view that the text of the Quran is essentially, the text we have today is essentially what was compiled by Uthman. So yeah, for the text there is some discussion also, but it is more about the oral details of the Quran. So yes, you cannot prove it through isnad, but you can make a compelling case, looking at the bigger picture on the conceptual level, that yes, we can be satisfied that the Quran is mutawatir. All right. The fourth chapter was about Tawatur in Hadith, which I've actually touched on already, so I just need to add a couple of points. Yes, I think I'll mention two issues here. One is, all right, when Tawatur came to be used in Hadith, it was not as powerful in terms of its consequences as it was for the Quran. Yeah, the Tawatur applied to the transmission of the Quran. This became important in the 4th century debates about the integrity of the Quran. Tahrif al-Quran. Yeah, this issue of the text of the Quran, as we have said, the Quran was always central to Muslim religious life, and there was not even any question about the reliability of the Quran until the first attested documentation we have of this was the late 3rd century Hijri. That some people started to try to cast doubt on the integrity of the text of the Quran, right? A group from among the Shia. And the concept of Tawatur proved to be very powerful, and it was one of the things that helped to convince people, even from among some of the Shia who held this opinion initially, came to realize, and this now became the dominant opinion, the almost overwhelming opinion among the Shia also, that yes, the text of the Quran is reliable, and we know this for a number of reasons, one of which is Tawatur. However, when applied to Hadith, it was not so successful. Number one, because there are very few Hadiths which are to the same level of public and widespread transmission as the Quran. And number two, because there are other issues, some of which are there for the Quran also. The Hadith might be mutawatir, but some scholars might believe it is mansukh, it is abrogated. Or they might interpret it in a different way. Or they might use theological or usul al-fiqh principles to say, all right, this hadith does not fit with the bigger picture of Islam, and so it is not reliable. And yeah, I think the final point I will mention, the last bullet point up there. So basically, in terms of defining the outward boundaries of Islam, the Quran is central to that. Of course, if someone does not accept the Quran or has doubts about the Quran, they cannot be Muslim. So yes, Tawatur is important for defining the outward boundary of Islam. The Quran and some other central practices, like the 5 prayers, number of rak'ah in each prayer, that Hajj has to be done to the Kaaba and so on. In terms of boundaries within Islam, essentially the essential conclusion of all of these debates and so on is that if you talk about hadiths being mutawatir, this tawatur is a lower level of tawatur than that of the Quran. So the highest level of tawatur defines the boundary outside Islam. The lower levels of tawatur might define the boundaries within Islam. And where do you draw those boundaries? It depends who you are and what you believe. For the Sunnis, that inner circle of Muslims is Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah. For the 12 or Shia, it is their belief, right, including the belief in the 12 Imams and so on. For the Zaydis, it might be something different and so on. One final issue related to this. In spite of the numerous compilations of mutawatir hadiths, only one that I have come across, it's actually Zaydi scholar al-Maqbali from Yemen, 11th century Hijri. Only one was kind of interested in trying to define, all right, besides the Quran, can we identify an ethical religious core of Islam, and which hadiths are a part of that? So things like, all right, there are many hadiths about not lying, about being sincere, and so on. So only al-Maqbali, as far as I have found, had this interest of trying to compile hadiths reflecting the core of Islam. All right, so I'm essentially done.